Have you ever noticed how silence can be heavier than noise? It lingers in the corners of empty rooms, whispers through the ticking of clocks, and makes the heart remember what it tries so hard to forget. Time has a way of stripping away the voices we love, leaving behind only echoes. Edward Hale, 67 years old, knew that silence too well. He was the CEO of a large company, respected by colleagues, feared by employees, and admired by the press. Yet none of those titles followed him home at night. At home, there was only the sound of his shoes against polished wooden floors and the faint hum of a refrigerator that never seemed to stop. His apartment overlooked the city skyline, all glass and steel, the kind of place that looked impressive in magazines but cold to the touch. Once, years ago, laughter had lived there. His wife, Margaret, used to fill the space with warmth, and his son, Daniel, once left his toy cars scattered across the rug. But Margaret had passed away more than a decade ago, and his son, well, their last words had been spoken in anger, and silence had done the rest. Edward's routine was as precise as the numbers he read every day. Wake up at 6:30. Coffee, black, no sugar. Read financial reports. Meetings, more coffee. End of the day, return to the apartment, eat alone, watch the news, and sleep. A life measured not in memories but in schedules. But lately, he had begun to feel something unsettling. His body, once strong and tall, carried a weight of fatigue. A few weeks earlier, his doctor had suggested regular checkups at the hospital nearby. Nothing urgent, just age reminding him it was present. And so, one morning, Edward left the hospital with papers tucked under his arm. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, vendors calling, children laughing somewhere far away. He crossed the street toward a small park, a place he had never noticed before despite passing by countless times. Perhaps he had never allowed himself to notice. There, on a wooden bench shaded by an old oak tree, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her hair was tied in a loose braid, and in her hands she held a small notebook filled with colorful drawings. Her shoulders trembled, as if she were trying very hard not to cry. Edward paused. Normally, he would have kept walking. His life was not one for strangers, and children especially reminded him too much of what he had lost. But something about her small frame, the way she pressed her hand over her face to hide her tears, pulled him closer. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure. The CEO in him was trained to make decisions quickly, but this was different. This was not a business deal or a boardroom problem. This was human. Finally, he cleared his throat gently. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deeper than intended. The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were red, her cheeks flushed. She shook her head silently, as if words might break her completely. Edward hesitated, then slowly sat down at the other end of the bench. He kept a respectful distance, as though the space between them might make it easier for her to breathe. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't heavy but careful. Around them, the park went on with its life. Birds hopping on the grass, the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of other children. After a few minutes, the girl spoke softly. "My grandma. She used to bring me here every week. She said this was her favorite tree." Edward turned his gaze toward the oak, its branches wide and ancient, as if it had seen countless lives pass beneath its shade. "And now?" he asked gently. The girl's lips trembled. "She's gone. She died last month." The words were simple, but they pierced the air with a weight Edward understood too well. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to say something wise, something that could fix the hurt, but what words could heal a wound like that? Instead, he looked at her notebook. "Those are very colorful drawings," he said, trying to shift the weight for just a moment. She sniffled, nodding. "I draw when I miss her. She always said I should never stop drawing." Edward's heart stirred. Margaret had once told him something similar: never stop writing, never stop remembering. But he had stopped. He had buried his memories under work, under duty, under pride. Looking at the girl, Edward felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. It was as if life had placed a fragile thread between them, two lonely souls on opposite ends of the same silence. For the first time in years, Edward didn't feel like rushing away. Life often surprises us when we least expect it. Sometimes the most profound encounters begin not with grand gestures, but with a simple question whispered in the silence: "Are you all right?" Time slows down in moments of quiet conversation. It bends, softens, and allows two strangers to see each other more clearly. For Edward and Lily, the park bench became a fragile bridge, one step away from loneliness, one step closer to something neither of them had planned. Edward adjusted his tie, an old habit whenever he felt uncertain. He wasn't used to speaking with children. Boardrooms, yes, negotiations, absolutely, but a child grieving her grandmother? That was uncharted territory. Still, he remained seated, sensing that walking away would feel wrong. "You know," Edward began cautiously, "this is a very sturdy tree. It must have been here a long time, maybe even when your grandmother was little." Lily tilted her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Do you really think so?" Edward studied the thick trunk, the way its bark twisted like an old scar, the roots gripping deep into the ground. Trees keep memories in their rings. Every year adds a circle. "If this one could speak, I'm sure it would tell you many stories about your grandmother." The girl's eyes softened. For a moment, she traced her finger along the wooden bench, as though she could feel her grandmother's presence there. "She used to say, 'Trees listen better than people,'" Lily whispered. Edward allowed himself a faint smile. Margaret had once said the same about music, that a piano understood feelings more than people did. Funny how wisdom traveled through different voices, but carried the same truth. Silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was gentle, like a blanket laid over two tired souls. Lily opened her notebook and showed him a drawing. A little girl holding hands with an elderly woman beneath a wide tree. The strokes were clumsy in places, yet full of emotion. "This was us," she said proudly, though her voice cracked. Edward studied the page carefully. "You're quite talented," he said sincerely. "You capture feelings, not just shapes. That's rare." Her cheeks colored with the faintest blush. "Grandma always said the same thing. But people at school, they don't really care about drawings." "They will one day," Edward replied, surprising even himself with the warmth in his tone. "One day people will realize that drawings, music, words, these are the things that keep memories alive." The girl nodded, hugging the notebook close to her chest. Edward glanced at his watch. Meetings waited for him, reports, decisions, signatures, but for once the urgency felt hollow. He stayed seated, as though rooted to that spot. "Do you live nearby?" he asked gently. "Yes," Lily said. "Just across the street. My mum works a lot now, so sometimes I come here alone. I don't like being in the apartment. It feels too quiet." Edward's heart tightened at her words. Quiet. Yes, he knew exactly what that felt like. "And your father?" he asked, then immediately regretted it when her face darkened. "He left a long time ago," she murmured, eyes fixed on the notebook. "It's just me and Mom now." Edward swallowed hard. He thought of Daniel, his own son. How many times had Daniel waited for him, only to hear, "I'm too busy"? How many soccer games missed, how many birthdays shortened by business calls? And then came the fight, the one that cut the fragile string between them. Pride had kept him from calling. Pride had turned into years. The ache in his chest was sharp. Looking at Lily, he saw not just her pain, but his son's face in the past, the boy who had once waited for his father to come home. Lily's small voice broke his thoughts. "Do you come here often?" Edward shook his head. Today was the first time. He hesitated, then added, "But maybe I should come more." Her eyes lifted, uncertain, yet hopeful. "Would you sit here again, sometimes?" Edward felt something shift inside him, a soft crack in the wall he had built around his heart. The CEO in him wanted to give a practical answer, a non-committal nod. But the man who had once loved, once laughed, found himself saying, "Yes, I think I would like that." The faintest smile crossed Lily's lips, and Edward realized it was the first time he had seen her look more like a child than a shadow of sorrow. They sat there until the sun began to dip lower, the air carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. At last, Edward stood, straightening his coat. "I should be going," he said softly. Lily hugged her notebook and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Edward paused, listening. When was the last time someone had thanked him for that? His world was full of voices demanding answers, never gratitude. He looked down at her, this little stranger with grieving eyes, and felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. As he walked away, the city noise swallowed him once more. Yet the silence in his heart was no longer quite as empty. Sometimes the smallest encounters plant the largest seeds. What begins as a simple act of listening can grow into a bond that heals not one soul, but two. The following week, Edward found himself standing at his office window, staring at the skyline. Meetings had been scheduled, reports demanded his attention, and yet his mind was elsewhere, beneath an old oak tree on a wooden bench, beside a little girl with grieving eyes and a notebook full of drawings. For decades, his life had been a calendar of obligations. But now, an unfamiliar thought lingered in his chest. What if I went back? At first, he dismissed it. CEOs didn't linger in parks. They didn't carve out time for conversations with children they barely knew. And yet, the idea refused to leave. It pulled at him, soft but persistent, like a forgotten melody. That afternoon, instead of heading home after work, Edward walked toward the park. The late summer sun painted the sky in shades of gold, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. He wondered if she would be there, or if perhaps he had imagined the entire encounter, like a dream too fragile to survive reality. But there she was. Lily sat on the same bench, her notebook open across her knees. Her braid was a little messier this time, her shoes scuffed with play. She was drawing intently, her small fingers smudged with colored pencils. Edward approached slowly, almost hesitant. "Busy artist today?" he asked. She looked up, her face lighting with a shy but genuine smile. "You came back." The words struck him with unexpected warmth. "I said I would, didn't I?" She nodded, tapping her pencil against the paper. "I was hoping you would." Edward sat beside her, leaving the familiar space of respect between them. He leaned slightly to glance at her notebook. Today's drawing was different, a tall building with windows glowing against the night sky. At the top, a single office light shone brighter than the rest. "What's this one?" he asked. "My mom's office," Lily explained. "She works late a lot. I wait for her by the window sometimes." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "I draw what I see so it feels less lonely." Edward's chest tightened. How many nights had his own son waited by a window for him to return? How many lights had Daniel stared at, hoping his father would come home sooner? "You're brave," Edward said quietly. "Not many children could turn loneliness into art." Lily shrugged. "Grandma taught me. She said sadness can be heavy, But if you put it on paper, the paper helps carry it. Edward thought of the stack of untouched journals in his study, gifts Margaret had once given him, urging him to write down his thoughts. He had never opened them. Instead, he had let the sadness press harder, burying himself in work. For the first time, he wondered what might have changed if he had listened. They sat together in comfortable quiet, broken only by the sound of pencils scratching against paper. After a while, Lily closed her notebook and asked, "What do you do? I mean, for work?" Edward chuckled softly, though the sound felt rusty. "I run a company, a very large company." Her eyes widened. "Like, you're the boss of everyone?" "In a way, yes." "That sounds lonely." The simplicity of her response stunned him. No one had ever described his life that way, not journalists, not colleagues, not even his son. Yet from the mouth of a 9-year-old, the truth was undeniable. "Yes," Edward admitted, his voice low. "It can be." Lily hugged her notebook against her chest. "Maybe you need a friend." He looked at her, this little stranger who had cracked open a door in his heart without even trying. "Maybe I do." The air between them softened, and for a moment Edward felt something rare: connection. Not through business deals or professional respect, but through honesty. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Edward knew he would return again. Not because of duty, but because he wanted to, because the silence in his home felt less unbearable now that he had someone waiting, even if that someone was a child on a park bench. When they finally stood to leave, Lily glanced up at him. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Edward hesitated, thinking of schedules, of meetings stacked like bricks. Then, with surprising ease, he said, "Yes, tomorrow." Her smile was small, but radiant, the kind that reminded him of a life he thought he had lost. As he walked back to the city streets, Edward realized something profound. The bench beneath the oak tree was no longer just a place of chance. It was becoming a place of healing. Friendship does not ask for age, status, or circumstance. It begins in the smallest gestures, in a return, in a smile, in the willingness to sit beside someone's sorrow. There are certain memories we bury so deep that we convince ourselves they are gone. Yet all it takes is a single question, a gentle look, or even the sound of a child's laughter to bring them back to the surface. Edward had returned to the park for the 3rd day in a row. It felt strange, almost indulgent, to step away from the world of contracts and deadlines. Each time he sat on that wooden bench beside Lily, the stiffness in his chest loosened, as though the tree's wide branches shielded him from the weight of years. That afternoon, Lily was drawing again, this time sketching a piano with delicate black and white keys. Edward watched silently until curiosity got the better of him. "Do you play?" he asked. Lily shook her head. "No, but Grandma used to play all the time. She said music is like a second heartbeat. You feel it even when you don't notice." Edward's breath caught. Margaret's piano still sat untouched in his living room, covered by a white sheet. He hadn't lifted it since the day of her funeral. He remembered her slender fingers gliding across the keys, the way she'd fill their evenings with soft melodies after Daniel went to bed. Music had been the language of their home until silence claimed it. Lily looked up, curious. "Do you play?" Edward hesitated. For decades he had kept his private life sealed away, never sharing even the smallest truths with others. Yet here was a little girl who asked with no judgment, no expectation, just curiosity. "Yes," he admitted slowly. "I used to play a long time ago." Her eyes lit up. "What did you play?" "Classics mostly, Chopin, Beethoven. But my wife, she loved simple songs, old folk tunes." His voice grew soft. "She said they reminded her of childhood summers." Lily leaned closer. "Do you ever play now?" Edward's throat tightened. He looked at the ground, at the small cracks in the pavement. "No, not anymore." She didn't press him. Instead, she opened her notebook to a blank page and began sketching a piano again, this one with someone seated at it. "Maybe you should," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The words pierced through him more deeply than she could ever know. Maybe you should. For a moment, Edward's mind drifted. He saw Daniel at 10 years old, sitting beside him on the piano bench, fumbling through scales. He had been so proud, so eager for his father's approval. But Edward had been distracted, always distracted, glancing at his watch, taking phone calls, muttering, "Later, son, later." And then later never came. "Mr. Hale," Lily's small voice pulled him back. "Yes?" "You look sad." He cleared his throat, straightening his posture, just remembering about her, your wife. Edward blinked, surprised. He hadn't told her about Margaret. But perhaps grief recognizes itself. It has a way of speaking without words. "Yes," he said softly. "About her." Lily hugged her notebook tightly, as though protecting her own memories. "It hurts, doesn't it? Even when you try to be strong." Edward's chest ached. Here was a child putting into words what he had never admitted even to himself. "Yes," he whispered. "It hurts." They sat in silence, the kind that doesn't suffocate, but heals. Around them, children played tag, their laughter floating in the air. A breeze rustled the oak leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs from a nearby garden. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to speak aloud what he had only carried in silence. He told Lily about Margaret's laughter, about the way she used to hum while cooking. He spoke of Daniel as a boy, how he used to line up toy soldiers across the living room floor. His voice broke once or twice, but Lily never interrupted. She just listened, the way his son once had, the way Margaret always had. When he finished, he felt lighter, as if unburdened. Lily finally said, "I think your wife would want you to play the piano again, so you don't forget the songs." Edward looked at her, struck by the clarity of her words. She was only 9, yet her wisdom was sharper than the advice of countless board members and consultants. "Perhaps you're right," he murmured. The sun dipped lower, casting golden rays across the park. Edward rose reluctantly, knowing he had to return to his world of numbers and decisions. But before leaving, he looked down at Lily and said, "Thank you for listening." Her small smile mirrored the one she had given him on the first day. That's what friends do. As he walked away, Edward realized she was right. They were friends, an unlikely pair, bound not by age or circumstance, but by grief and the courage to share it. The past never truly disappears. It waits for us in music, in stories, in the people willing to listen. Healing begins when we dare to let those memories breathe again. That evening, Edward returned to his apartment carrying something new inside him. A quiet insistence, a whisper that would not leave him alone. Lily's words echoed in his mind. "Maybe you should, so you don't forget the songs." The elevator doors opened to the familiar silence of his home. The walls were pristine, the furniture impeccable, yet the air felt lifeless. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase on the table, and poured himself a glass of water. But instead of settling into his usual routine, his steps carried him down the hall toward a door he rarely opened. He paused, hand trembling against the brass knob. Behind this door was Margaret's piano room. He hadn't entered it in years. The first time he had closed the door after her passing, he had thought it would be temporary. Just a few weeks until the grief dulled. But weeks became months, and months became years. With a deep breath he turned the knob. The hinges groaned softly, as though the room itself were surprised to be disturbed. There it was, the piano. A beautiful upright, its dark wood dulled by a layer of dust. A white sheet covered part of it, hanging unevenly, like a forgotten shroud. The sight struck him like a blow. Memories flooded back. Margaret laughing as she practiced, Daniel's small hands fumbling through scales, evenings filled with songs that once stitched their family together. Edward stepped forward, his shoes pressing softly against the carpet. He reached out, pulling the sheet away. Dust swirled in the golden glow of the lamp he had switched on. His hand brushed the keys, cool beneath his fingertips. For years, he had avoided this very moment. Because touching the piano meant touching the wound. And yet Lily's voice was still in his ears, urging him not to forget. He sat down slowly on the bench, the wood creaking under his weight. His fingers hovered above the keys, stiff and unsure, like strangers to an old language. He pressed one key, middle C. The note rang out, flat and hesitant, yet clear. The sound startled him, as if the piano itself were waking from a long sleep. He pressed another, then another. A chord formed, rough and broken but familiar, and suddenly he was no longer in the present. He was 30 years younger, Margaret at his side, her laughter mingling with the music. He was watching Daniel, wide-eyed and eager, clapping when his father played. The apartment had once been filled with life, with song. Edward's chest tightened, and for a moment he almost stopped, but something urged him on. Slowly, awkwardly, he began to play a melody Margaret had loved, an old folk tune she used to hum in the kitchen. His fingers stumbled, the rhythm uneven, but the notes carried with them something no perfection could replace: memory. Tears blurred his vision as the song filled the room. He had not cried in years, not even at Margaret's funeral, when duty and pride had held him prisoner. But now, with every note, the walls of his grief crumbled. He played until his shoulders shook, until the tears ran freely down his cheeks. When the last note faded, silence returned. But it was no longer the suffocating silence he had lived with. This silence was softer, filled with echoes of what had been. Edward sat there for a long while, his hands resting on the keys. He thought of Lily, of her courage to speak of her grandmother so openly. She had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: permission. Permission to remember, permission to feel, permission to play again. That night, instead of falling asleep to the drone of the television, Edward opened one of the empty journals Margaret had once given him. For the first time, he began to write. Not about business or numbers, but about memories, her laughter, Daniel's childhood, the way the apartment smelled of cinnamon on winter mornings. Words poured onto the page, clumsy but honest, like his music. When he finally closed the notebook, he felt lighter, not healed, no, but no longer suffocating. As he drifted to sleep, Edward realized something important. Healing doesn't come in grand moments. It begins in the quiet. One note, one memory, one conversation at a time. And he knew deep down that tomorrow he would return to the park. Because for the first time in many years, he wanted to share the music with someone who would listen. Grief may silence us for a time, but it cannot silence forever what once brought us life. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to lift the cover, to press one key, and let the music remind us who we are. The next afternoon, Edward carried with him a secret. For the first time in years, there was something he wanted to tell, not to a colleague, not to his staff, not even to his own reflection in the mirror, but to Lily. The park was quiet when he arrived. The old oak spread its shade generously, the air warm with the scent of blooming roses nearby. Lily was already on the bench, swinging her feet as she scribbled in her notebook. When she saw him, her face brightened, and Edward felt a ripple of warmth move through him. "You came again," she said, her voice full of the kind of excitement only children could give freely. "As promised," Edward replied, lowering himself onto the bench. He looked at her notebook. "What are you drawing today?" "A stage," she said proudly, tilting the page toward him. There was a piano in the center, and rows of stick figures sat as the audience. "Grandma always dreamed of me performing one day, but I get too nervous to show my drawings. I just imagine it instead." Edward studied the drawing. The piano seemed to shine in her sketch, glowing with life. He hesitated, then spoke. "You know, I sat at a piano yesterday." Her eyes widened. "You did?" "Yes. For the first time in many years." He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "And I played one of my wife's favorite songs. It wasn't perfect. My fingers stumbled, but it felt alive again." Lily gasped softly, her notebook pressed against her chest. "That's wonderful. What song?" "A folk tune, simple but full of memories." She leaned closer, her eyes shining. "Will you play it again? For me?" Edward chuckled, though the thought made his heart beat faster. He had played for thousands in business presentations, commanding boardrooms with confidence, but the idea of playing for one small girl felt far more vulnerable. "Perhaps," he said gently, "but only if you promise to share something too. Maybe one of your drawings." Lily considered, biting her lip. Then she nodded. "Deal." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the agreement settle like a thread between them. Around them, the park pulsed with life. A dog barking joyfully, a couple laughing as they strolled, the soft rustle of leaves above. "You know," Lily said after a while, "I think music and drawings are the same. They're both ways to say things you can't say out loud." Edward looked at her, astonished by the wisdom in her words. "You're right," he said softly. "Both are languages of the heart." Lily tilted her head. "So if you play the piano and I show you my drawings, maybe we'll understand each other better, like we're speaking without words." Her innocence disarmed him, peeling away the layers of pride he had worn for so long. He realized that this little girl was teaching him what decades of success never had, that connection mattered more than perfection. Edward leaned back against the bench, looking up through the branches of the oak. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering patterns across the ground. He thought of Daniel again, his son who once begged him to play just one more song, just one more game. The ache of regret pressed heavy, but beneath it was something new, a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, if he could open himself to Lily, he could one day open himself to Daniel again. Lily tugged gently at his sleeve. "Mr. Hale." "Yes, Lily. Can I tell you something? A secret?" "Of course." She lowered her voice, as though afraid the oak might overhear. "Sometimes I feel like Grandma's still here, like when I draw or when I sit under this tree. It's like she's watching, smiling at me. Is that silly?" Edward's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't silly at all, that he too felt Margaret near him as he played, as if her laughter had returned to fill the room. But the words caught in his chest. Instead, he placed a hand gently over hers, his voice steady. "No, Lily. It's not silly, it's love, and love never really leaves." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, their grief met in the quiet air, not as a weight, but as a bond. As the sun dipped low, Edward knew he would not return home the same. He had shared something precious with her, and in return, she had given him something he thought he had lost, courage to feel again. When they stood to leave, Lily whispered, "Next time, maybe you can tell me more about the songs your wife loved, and I'll show you the picture I've been afraid to finish." Edward nodded, his heart both heavy and light. "Next time," he promised. And for the first time in many years, he looked forward to tomorrow, not for what he could achieve, but for what he could share. The heart heals not in solitude, but in the gentle exchange of memories, dreams, and hopes. To share our hidden songs and unfinished drawings is to remind each other that we are not alone. The next Sunday, Edward did something he hadn't done in decades. He opened the curtains of his living room wide, letting in the morning light. Dust swirled in the air like tiny dancers, settling on the polished surface of the grand piano that had long been more decoration than instrument. For hours, he sat at the bench, his fingers trembling over the ivory keys. He practiced the folk tune he had played once for Margaret, the one he had whispered about to Lily. Each wrong note stung his pride, but he pressed on, repeating, correcting, starting again. And then, slowly, something shifted. His hands began to remember, his heart guiding where memory failed. The melody emerged, not flawless, not grand, but honest. For the first time, Edward wasn't playing for applause. He was playing for connection. That afternoon, he carried this fragile gift with him to the park. The bench under the oak felt different now, charged with anticipation. Lily was waiting, a sketchbook clutched tightly in her arms. "You brought it, didn't you?" she asked, eyes bright with hope. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Brought what?" She giggled. "The song." He laughed softly, shaking his head at her persistence. "Yes, Lily, I brought the song." Together they walked to the community hall nearby, where Lily had said there was a piano. The building was old, the walls lined with faded photographs of school plays and choir concerts, but in the corner stood a modest, upright piano. Edward's chest tightened as he sat on the worn bench. His reflection in the polished wood startled him. An older man, fragile, uncertain. He had once been a master of boardrooms, commanding with sharp words and louder victories. Yet here, with one small girl watching, he felt more vulnerable than ever. Lily settled beside him, her sketchbook on her lap. "I'll be brave if you're brave," she whispered. Her words steadied him more than any applause ever had. He took a deep breath and let his fingers fall gently on the keys. The first notes trembled, uncertain, like a voice breaking after years of silence. But as the melody unfolded, Edward felt the room change. The piano's imperfections, the slight, tinny echo of its strings, the creak of the pedals made the song all the more real. He closed his eyes. In the music, he saw Margaret smile, heard her laughter. He felt Daniel's small hands once tugging at his sleeve, begging, "Play it again, Dad." When he opened his eyes, Lily was watching him with rapt attention, her mouth slightly open, as though afraid to breathe too loudly and break the moment. The final chord lingered, trembling in the air, before fading into silence. Edward's hands rested on the keys, his chest rising and falling with the weight of release. Lily clapped her hands to her mouth, her eyes shining. That was beautiful," she whispered. Edward swallowed hard. "It wasn't perfect. It was perfect to me," she said firmly. Then, with a shy smile, she opened her sketchbook. "Now it's my turn." She turned the page to reveal a drawing she had hesitated to finish. A little girl on a stage, standing beside a grand piano, the spotlight glowing warmly around her. In the front row, a woman with kind eyes watched proudly, and beside her, an older man with silver hair sat, his hands folded in awe. Edward's breath caught. The sketch wasn't just art, it was a vision, a dream, and in that dream, he recognized himself. "Lily," his voice cracked. It's us," she said softly. "Or maybe not us now, but one day, when we're both brave enough." The air grew heavy with meaning. Edward felt something shift deep inside him, not just hope, but the stirring of purpose. For years he had lived as though his story were already written, sealed with loss and regret. But looking at Lily's drawing, he realized that stories could be redrawn, songs could be replayed, futures could be rewritten. He closed the sketchbook gently, his hand trembling as it rested on the cover. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You've given me more than I ever expected." Lily leaned against him, her small shoulder pressing into his arm. "You gave me music," she said simply, "and music makes everything feel alive." Edward looked down at her, at the innocence that had rekindled something long buried in him. He thought of Daniel again, not with the crushing weight of regret, but with a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to play for him too. As they left the hall, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. Edward felt as though the day had been written for them, as though the universe itself had paused to listen. For the first time in decades, he did not feel like a man defined by what he had lost. He felt like a man discovering, through a child's faith and his own trembling courage, the gift of being alive. When music flows from the heart, it ceases to be about performance and becomes a bridge, a way to meet each other in the silence between notes. Sometimes, the bravest act is not to play flawlessly, but simply to play at all. That night, Edward could not sleep. The melody he had played for Lily still echoed inside his chest, but with it came another sound, one that lived only in memory. Daniel's laughter, the way his son had once spun around the living room, pretending to be a conductor while Edward played. How long had it been since they had shared that joy? Years, no, decades. The silence between them had stretched so wide that Edward had convinced himself it could never be crossed. But Lily's drawing lingered in his mind, burning like a lantern in the dark. A little girl on a stage, and beside her, a silver-haired man, alive and proud. That image whispered something Edward had long buried. It's not too late. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table staring at the phone. His hands shook as though it were heavier than any instrument he had ever lifted. He thought of all the times he had wanted to call, but hadn't. Birthdays missed, holidays spent in solitude, the widening distance he had built out of pride and fear. But now, Lily's words echoed. "I'll be brave if you're brave." He dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then came a familiar voice, deeper and steadier than he remembered. "Hello?" Edward's throat tightened. "Daniel." A pause, the sound of his son breathing. "Dad?" The word was cautious, almost disbelieving. Edward closed his eyes. "Yes, it's me." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that had ruled for years. This one felt fragile, like glass that might shatter, or perhaps like soil, waiting for the first seed. "What do you want?" Daniel asked at last, his tone guarded. Edward swallowed. "I want to try again. I want to see you." Daniel let out a breath, heavy and uncertain. "After all this time?" "I know," Edward said quickly. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I let the years slip away, but I've been learning, remembering. I played the piano again, Daniel. The same song I used to play for you and your mother." The line grew quiet. Then, in a voice rough with memory, Daniel said, "Mum loved that song." Edward's eyes filled. "She did, and I stopped playing after she was gone. But someone reminded me that music isn't meant to be buried. It's meant to be shared." There was another long pause. Finally, Daniel said, "I don't know if I can forgive everything, but maybe we can talk." Edward gripped the phone tighter. "That's all I ask." They agreed to meet the following weekend. The days crawled by, each hour carrying both dread and hope. Edward practiced the song every evening, not for perfection, but for courage. He wanted his son to hear it again, not as a performance, but as an offering. When the day finally came, Edward dressed carefully, his hands trembling as he buttoned his shirt. He hadn't felt this nervous since his wedding day. The cafe Daniel had chosen was modest, tucked on a quiet street. As Edward approached, he spotted his son through the window, broad-shouldered streaks of grey in his hair, his features both familiar and foreign. Daniel looked up as Edward entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel nodded toward the seat across from him. "Hi, Dad." Edward sat, his chest tight. "Hello, son." The conversation began cautiously, circling around safe topics, the weather, the town, Daniel's work, but beneath the words ran an unspoken current, a trembling possibility. At one point, Edward leaned forward. "Do you remember the piano, how you used to conduct with that wooden spoon?" A flicker of a smile broke through Daniel's guarded expression. "I remember. You always slowed down just so I could feel like I was in charge." Edward chuckled softly, his eyes misting. "You were in charge, at least of my heart." The air shifted. Daniel looked down at his coffee, his jaw tight. "Why now, Dad, after all the years of silence?" Edward searched for the right words. "Because someone showed me that silence doesn't have to be the end. A little girl named Lily reminded me that music, love, can still reach across years if we let it." Daniel blinked. "Lily?" Edward smiled faintly. "She's a friend. She believes in second chances." For the first time, Daniel's face softened, his guard lowering just a little. Maybe we could try. Slowly." Edward's heart leapt. He nodded. "Slowly is fine. Slowly is everything." That evening, Edward returned home, exhausted yet lighter than he had been in years. He sat at the piano and played, not just for Margaret's memory, not just for Lily, but for Daniel, for the hope that one day father and son might stand side by side again, joined by the song that had never truly left them. And as the notes filled the room, Edward realized the bridge he had thought impossible to build was already forming, one trembling note at a time. Reconciliation doesn't come in grand gestures. It begins with the courage to dial a number, to say a single word, to play a single note. Each step, however small, becomes part of the bridge that leads us back to love. The following week, Edward walked through Willow Street with a lighter step than he had in years. He had not slept much, yet he felt alive, carried by the fragile thread of hope that had begun to weave itself between him and Daniel. But there was someone else he wanted Daniel to meet, someone who had, unknowingly, opened the locked doors of his heart. That Saturday afternoon, Lily came bounding into Edward's little garden, her sketchbook under her arm. "Mr. Edward," she called, her braid swinging behind her, "I made something new." Edward smiled, motioning her inside. The piano waited, polished and ready. "Perfect timing, Lily. Today I want to introduce you to someone very important." Her eyes widened. "Who?" "My son," Edward said softly. The word still felt strange on his tongue, but warm. "His name is Daniel." Lily's face lit up. "The son from your stories? The one who used to wave a spoon like a conductor?" Edward chuckled, touched. "That's the one." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Edward's chest tightened as he opened it to reveal Daniel, hesitant, taller than Edward remembered, carrying both caution and curiosity in his eyes. "Dad," Daniel said simply. "Come in," Edward replied, stepping aside. Daniel's gaze fell immediately on Lily, who stood with her sketchbook pressed to her chest. She studied him openly, with the kind of fearless wonder only a child could possess. "Are you Daniel?" she asked. Daniel blinked, surprised. Yes. And you are?" "I'm Lily." She smiled brightly. "I'm your dad's friend." Something in Daniel's guarded expression softened just slightly. "His friend?" "Yes, Lily said with complete conviction. I remind him to play music and to be brave. Edward laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. She does indeed. They gathered in the small living room. Daniel sat stiffly on the sofa while Lily flipped open her sketchbook, turning it toward him. I made this, she announced. The page showed a drawing of a piano on a stage, a man with silver hair seated before it, and a girl holding flowers beside him. The caption, written in careful block letters, read, Music can fix broken hearts. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. His throat worked, but no words came. At last he glanced at Edward. She knows about us? Edward hesitated, then nodded. She knows enough. She reminded me that silence isn't the end. Daniel looked back at Lily, who was now humming softly, tracing invisible notes in the air with her finger. Something inside him shifted. He couldn't explain it, but this child, this unexpected presence, felt like a bridge he hadn't known he needed. Do you play? Lily asked him suddenly. Daniel shook his head. No, never learned. That's okay, she said. You can listen. Sometimes listening is the bravest thing. The words struck deeper than Daniel expected. Listening. That was something he had never felt his father did when he was younger, and yet here was this child offering it as a gift, a path back. Edward, sensing the delicate moment, sat down at the piano. His hands hovered above the keys. Would you both like to hear the song again? Lily clapped eagerly. Daniel nodded, though quietly. The first notes filled the air, trembling yet steady. Edward poured into them everything he could not yet say aloud: regret, longing, and hope. Lily swayed, her eyes closed, lost in the sound. Daniel sat rigid at first, but gradually his shoulders eased. Memories stirred, his mother humming, his father's hands gliding across the keys, the boy he had once been, conducting with a spoon. When the final chord faded, the room was silent. Then Lily whispered, See, it's a song that makes broken things whole. Edward's eyes glistened. Daniel's jaw tightened as though he was holding back more than he wished to reveal. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low. It's beautiful, Dad. Edward's heart nearly broke at the word. Dad. The rest of the afternoon passed gently. They shared tea and cookies, Lily chatting freely, filling every quiet space that might otherwise have turned heavy. Daniel found himself answering her questions about his work, his favorite foods, whether he liked dogs or cats. Slowly, the tension began to unravel, thread by thread. As the sun dipped low, Daniel rose to leave. At the door, he looked back at Lily. Thanks for being here. Lily grinned. You're welcome. Come back soon. Mr. Edward plays better when you listen. Daniel chuckled softly, the first laugh Edward had heard from him in decades. When the door closed, Edward turned to Lily, his voice thick with gratitude. You did more today than I could have in years. Lily simply shrugged, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. That's what friends are for. Edward sat at the piano once more, playing a quiet melody as the room glowed with twilight. For the first time he believed, truly believed, that his family's broken song could find harmony again. Sometimes the bond between generations is not rebuilt by words alone, but by the innocence of those who remind us what matters most. Children often see clearly what adults have buried: love, hope, the possibility of forgiveness. The following weeks unfolded like the slow opening of a flower. What had once been silence between Edward and Daniel was now cautious conversation. It wasn't easy. Old wounds resisted healing, but there was a shift, undeniable and fragile, like spring after a long, bitter winter. Lily continued to visit almost daily, carrying her sketches and boundless optimism. She had become the golden thread that held father and son together, weaving her laughter into the spaces where words failed. One afternoon, Lily announced her grand idea. "You both need to share the music with more people," she declared. "Not just me." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, little dreamer?" "A concert," she said with certainty. "Right here in Willow Street. You'll play, Mr. Edward, and Daniel will be there to listen. Everyone should hear the song that fixes hearts." Daniel laughed softly. "A concert? Dad hasn't played in years." Edward looked at his son, then at Lily. For the first time, the thought didn't terrify him. Instead, it stirred something bold inside him. Perhaps she's right. And so, preparations began. Word spread quickly along Willow Street. Neighbors who had once heard Edward's piano as children whispered of his return. Families promised to come, eager to witness the music that had slept for decades. Edward polished his instrument until it shone. Daniel, though reluctant at first, helped organize chairs in the garden and even hung strings of lanterns. Lily painted a poster with bright letters. "One night only. The song of broken and mended hearts." On the evening of the concert, the garden glowed under a canopy of warm lights. Neighbors filled the seats, murmuring with excitement. Children ran about, clutching paper programs Lily had proudly designed. Edward, dressed in a simple suit, stood by the piano with trembling hands. His gaze found Daniel, who sat in the front row beside Lily. For a moment, fear threatened to steal his breath. But then Daniel gave the faintest nod, a silent promise. "I'm here." Edward sat at the keys. The hush fell instantly, as though the night itself leaned closer to listen. He began softly, fingers gliding across ivory, weaving the familiar melody he had once played only for Lily. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, every note carried the weight of his story, the sorrow of absence and the miracle of return. The song rose higher, swelling with emotion. Edward felt tears sting his eyes, but he did not falter. He thought of his late wife's gentle smile, of Daniel as a boy waving his spoon like a conductor, of Lily's unshakable faith. All of it poured into the music, a river of memory and hope. The audience leaned forward, caught in the current. Some closed their eyes, others held hands. Children sat still, entranced. Edward's heart thundered as the final chords rang out, strong, luminous, unbroken. Silence followed, and then applause erupted, wild and thunderous. Neighbors rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even weeping, but Edward heard only one voice. "Dad." Daniel stood, his eyes shining. He stepped forward, past the crowd, until he reached his father. Without hesitation, he embraced him. The world blurred as Edward clutched his son tightly. For the first time in decades, the wall between them crumbled completely. "I should have been there," Edward whispered. "I should never have let silence take your place." Daniel's voice broke as he replied, "And I should have tried harder to understand, but we're here now, that's what matters." They held each other, the applause still echoing around them, though it no longer mattered. The true concert was in their reconciliation. Lily, beaming, skipped up beside them. "See, I told you, music can fix broken hearts." Both men laughed through their tears. Edward placed a hand gently on Lily's shoulder, and sometimes so can a little girl with too much courage. That night became legend on Willow Street. The story of Edward's concert spread beyond the neighborhood, of an old man who found his son again, of a child who taught them both how to listen. Edward continued to play, no longer for empty rooms, but for the people he loved. Daniel became a regular presence, bringing laughter back into the house. And Lily never stopped drawing, filling her sketchbooks with pictures of pianos, lanterns, and families reunited. Years later, when Edward's hands grew too frail to play, it was Daniel who sat beside him, turning the pages of the music sheets. And when Lily grew older, she too would touch the keys, carrying forward the melody that had once mended two broken hearts. For in the end, it wasn't just a song. It was a bridge, a reminder that forgiveness, like music, lingers far beyond the last note. Thus ended the story of Willow Street, not with silence, but with harmony reborn. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.